Hi, I'm here to introduce to you the delights of the Anti-Sicilian. If you like, this is a sort of anti-Sicilian video. I can only hope that an anti-Sicilian one never comes to fruition. These quite timid variations are becoming more popular as a way of frustrating the likes of Sicilian dragon players, myself included, who are more accustomed to nail-biting encounters involving do-or-die attacks. The problem is that this rather tedious tactic is only too frequently succeeding. The long and short of it is that these lines must now be taken seriously. The systems I am about to recommend for black are generally my own favourites, and those that aren't I will soon be adopting. They are simple and hopefully effective antidotes. The Sicilian C3, or the Alapin-Sveshnikov variation, is the mother of all anti-Sicilians. The stigma attached to it as being dull and rather boring, in my view, still stands, although it has become more socially acceptable since being adopted by the likes of world champion or ex-world champion Anatoly Karpov. White prepares to get a strong pawn centre with d4, c takes d4 and c takes d4. This is something which black cannot really allow. I'm suggesting that black takes advantage of the fact that the white knight can't come to the c3 square here by playing d5. If white advances this pawn, black can obtain a good French defence with bishop to f5, pawn d4 and then e6, a highly satisfactory position for black. Instead, white is much more likely to capture on d5, e-d5, when, for the moment at least, it's safe for the black queen to come into the centre. Queen takes d5. White, with a few holes here on c2 and d3, is really forced to continue d4. And let's say a developing move, knight out to f6, and white follows suit, knight f3. Now here there's a few possibilities for black, knight c6 for example, or simply e6, but I'm suggesting the aggressive continuation, bishop to g4. This exerts further pressure on the d4 pawn, of course because of the pin for the knight and the queen on d1. From here, let's say that white has three modes of play which I'd like to discuss. The first is a new idea of Sveshnikov's, which is queen a4 check. The reason behind this will become clear soon. Bishop to e2, with bishop e3 bolstering the centre, is another white plan, and instead of bishop e3, also knight a3 has been employed on a regular basis. From here the knight can come to either b5 or to c2. Beginning with queen a4 check, black will prevent the check, knight c6, and now bishop c4, this is the point. White evicts the queen from the d5 square. Now to illustrate this variation, I'd like to demonstrate a miniature. These are fairly rare in the C3 Sicilian. For those of you that have seen the Sicilian Dragon video, you'll notice that this game is sweet revenge for Richard Britton, who suffered horribly against Martin Olsson's Sicilian Dragon. Britton, as black, retreated the queen to d7, after which Olsson grabbed this pawn on c5. You'll notice now that black gets an awful lot of compensation for this pawn which white tries to look after. In particular, all of his pieces are amassed on the queen side. Black took the knight on f3, bishop takes f3, shattering white's kingside pawns. White was forced to recapture, and then black played e6, simply developing the bishop on f8. White played b4, a bit pawn greedy, bishop to e7, preparing castles, and white developed his c1 bishop. Of course, he's going to worry about castling kingside because his king will be particularly exposed over there. Black swung the knight into the centre, knight d5, and in view of the knight capturing on e3, white opted to concede his light square bishop. Bishop takes d5. Well, black ended up with an isolated pawn with e takes d5, but of course we now see that the queen has a fast route to white's king side. The white knight came to d2, and black exerted pressure this time on the queen side with bishop f6. The c pawn of course is under threat, so white played rook c1 to defend it, and black simply castled. So the white king of course is particularly vulnerable now. Should it stay in the centre, it can't castle queenside. Castling kingside looks pretty grim. He played f4, possibly to vacate the f3 square for the white knight. Well, there's an open file to be used, rook fe8, very sensible, and the white queen retreated to b3. It's not completely clear what white can do. Now black crashed through in the centre, d4, utilising the pin along the e file. White took, c takes d4, a forced continuation, and the black knight zapped in. Look how the knight on d4 dominates the board. Well, in particular, of course, the queen's on pre, queen c4, but now splat. We're near the end of the game. A rook for bishop sacrifice, the exchange sack on e3, rook takes e3 check. White must recapture, f takes e3, but after bishop h4 check, threw in the towel. If, for example, king f1, then queen h3 check, king g1, and queen takes e3 check. Absolutely horrendous for white. Of course, on king d1, queen g4 check is even more terminal. After bishop e2, defending the knight on f3, the correct response is e6 in view of the steamroller c4 and then d5, which would gain white a lot of space. After e6, I'd like to demonstrate another short game highlighting some key concepts. Here white played h3. This tries to force black into taking on f3, but of course retreating the bishop here is far better. If black is going to part with that light square bishop, white's going to have to weaken his king side quite considerably. White castled here, knight came out to c6, again putting pressure here on the d4 pawn, and this was supported with the bishop to e3. Now black felt the time was right to trade on d4, cd and cd. Then he continued with his development, bishop e7. Now we can see one advantage of trading on d4 is that now white has an isolated pawn here. Of course, to white's benefit is the c3 square, which is now available for the knight. Knight c3 was played, and the black queen retreated to d6. The mystery players in this encounter are the highly entertaining Bogdan Lalic as black and the Russian Chernaev as white. In this particular game, white played a3, but I'd now like to cut to an alternative g4. This is the weakening of the king side which I mentioned earlier on, and was played in the 1994 Moscow game Seferdjan-Shipov. The black bishop retreated to g6, and white now knew he was definitely going to get the bishop after knight e5. You may see that black can now win a pawn by capturing on e5. But the problem is then the black king would be extremely exposed along the a4 to e8 diagonal. Instead, black castled, and white pushed forward and supported in the centre with f4. This looks quite threatening, but white is exposing himself. There's a lot of space behind those pawns. Black moved his knight into d5, a superb outpost for the knight. And in fact, white felt the need to trade off. Knight takes d5, but of course now the queen is very well placed in the centre. It returns to that d5 square. The white knight captured the bishop before it had a chance to move onto the e4 square. Black recaptured, h takes g6. Now, in this position white has two bishops but an exposed king. His pawns are weak and black's structure is better. The pawn on g6 is far more useful than when it was on h7. In fact, black's position is completely fine. He was able to mop up white's weak pawns and won in just 37 moves. Returning to the game played at Hastings 1995, we saw a3. The point behind this is probably to prevent the black knight from coming to b4, from where it can come and blockade the d4 pawn on d5. Black castled, and white connected his rooks with queen b3. This also attacks the b7 pawn, and black's reply is an excellent one. Instead of weakening his queen side with a move like b6 for example, which would create some holes on a6 and b7, he plays a6. Of course, the point being that after queen takes b7, simply rook fb8 would trap the queen. The rook started coming into action, rook fd1 and then rook fd8. Of course, this b7 pawn is still out of bounds. White played rook ac1, and now we see another reason behind a6. Black expanded on the queen side with b5. One possible reason for this is a knight a5 to c4 manoeuvre. White, possibly anticipating this plan, retreated the queen to a2, but then came b4. Probably what white should have done here is move the knight over to a4, but this would leave black a free roll in the centre with knight d5. Instead, white entered into a dubious tactic which certainly didn't pay any dividends. d5. Black captured on d5, e takes d5, and only now the white knight moved to a4. The point behind this is the knight is hoping to hop into b6 and ultimately recapture on d5. Then maybe the black queen will be exposed on d6, whereas of course white's queen is out of danger here on a2. Well, black took on f3, bishop takes f3, and white was forced to recapture with the bishop to avoid crippling his kingside pawns. Bishop takes f3, and the black knight swung into e5. Now of course this bishop is a target on f3. Really what should have happened is the bishop retreating to e2. But although white's got two fairly nice bishops, there's certainly not enough compensation for the pawn. Rather, white attempted to regain his sacrificed pawn with bishop takes d5, but after knight takes d5, knight into b6, Bogdan-Lalich found complete flaw in this plan with the excellent knight f3 check. at the moment the knight is pinned to the queen, but white in fact resigned here, noticing that after g takes f3, queen g6 check would escape the pin, and after, say, king h1, black can just win the piece on b6, leaving him with an easily winning position.
This is Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for onlinechesslessons.net. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, the 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from onlinechesslessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damian for onlinechesslessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.